This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 293rd episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I was thrilled to learn that Helping Writers Become Authors was listed once more in Writer's Digest's 101 Best Websites for Writers this year. So, of course, I have to send out a major thank you to all of you word players who wrote in to nominate it. So thank you. I have such fun sharing my writing journey and discoveries with all of you. So thank you for joining me in this little corner of the writing world every week. The latest post in the video series on my blog is the lazy technique that can cripple suspenseful chapter endings. It offers an example of what might seem to be a great chapter ending, and then shows you why it's lazy and how to make it fantastic instead. To find the post, visit my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And now, I hope you enjoy this week's podcast, entitled Most Common Writing Mistakes, Part 40, Scenes That Don't Matter to the Story. What is a story but scenes? Put one scene after another, and you have a story. Of course, it's a little more complicated than that. These scenes have to hang together in a way that makes sense. They have to create a contiguous arc. Every one of those scenes needs to be integral to that arc. If a scene isn't integral, then it doesn't belong in the story. So as we're going to find out in this one of our most common writing mistakes, it's just as simple as that. And just as hard. Because sometimes writers can't see the forest for the trees. When you're writing along, creating as you go, it can be difficult to realize when you've just written a scene that doesn't matter to your story. It can be even harder when you've written a scene that you know isn't 100% essential, but you can't bear to cut it because it's so darn fun. Surely a scene like that can get a free pass and stay in the story. What's it going to hurt, right? Turns out it might hurt your entire book. Compared to movies, plays, and short stories, books are sprawling beasts. That means they can't help but be a little looser than their more upright media pals. The good news in that revelation is that the sheer bigness of novels gives writers a little more room for error. If you write one little extraneous scene, it's probably not going to kill your book. But the bad news is that all this sprawl makes it much easier for us to fail to identify the unnecessary scenes, especially when we're so close to and unobjective about our stories. Ultimately, the type of scenes that are unnecessary to your story will be completely unique depending on your characters and your plot. But here are 4 types of scene that are frequent culprits. 1. Minor character relationships. Minor characters often turn out to be some of the most fun people to write in any story. It can be tempting to explore them in ways that aren't actually necessary to moving the plot forward. This isn't to say minor character relationships, both with the protagonist and amongst themselves, aren't important, necessary, and awesome ways to layer the plot and the themes. But they also can run away with us when we're not looking. I find this to be especially true of romantic relationships. If you've got a flirtation budding between minors or between the protag and a minor character, look at it extra hard to make sure it's important and not just something that you're having fun with. 2. Point A to point B filler. Whenever you switch settings or jump time in your story, you're usually going to have to account for what happened between point A and point B, if only to avoid disorienting readers. But don't get sucked into dramatizing, that is showing, actions that don't actually matter to the story. Your character's time spent riding the subway to Grandma's house doesn't need to be dramatized. Chances are it may not even need to be referenced. Although novels inevitably do need to fill in more blanks than movies, Novelists can take some lessons from screenplays, which usually cut between settings and time gaps without any explanation. Readers catch on faster than you might think. 3. Old ground recovered. Avoid repetition like the Ebola virus. You will hardly ever need to dramatize a conversation in which characters repeat themselves or recount events the readers have already witnessed. Court scenes, newspaper interviews, reports to superiors, and even just conversations with previously absent characters are going to be frequent culprits. 4. Research dumps. A while back, I read a novel in which the main character was selling a coin collection. The coins themselves weren't particularly pertinent to the plot, and yet scene after scene focused on the details of the coin buying business. Every single one of these scenes could have been cut without affecting the plot. There's nothing wrong with using information like this to bring color and realism to a scene, but the scene itself should never be about the information, unless, of course, it's actually driving the plot. Before we identify a few important tricks for actually discovering all this dead weight in your story, let's first consider why you should even bother tracking down these sneaky little freeloaders. Unnecessary scenes, bore readers. Readers are laser focused. Unlike us, they aren't automatically in love with this story. They don't want to watch the characters read from the phone book. They don't want to read about stuff that doesn't matter. They want the good stuff, and they want it right now. When your characters spend scene after scene talking about their coin collections, readers are likely to start skipping ahead. Unnecessary scenes will mislead readers. Unlike you, readers don't know where your story is headed. In some instances, they won't be bored by your unnecessary scenes because they don't know what they're reading is unnecessary. They're reading all this with intent fascination, storing away the information because they believe it will all turn out to be important later on. When the foreshadowing doesn't pan out, they're going to be left confused and probably mad because they're still holding on to clues that weren't really clues at all. Unnecessary scenes derail the plot. Let's say you're writing a political thriller, but you find yourself writing scene after scene about your protagonist's crush on a reporter. That could work out just ducky, especially if the reporter turns out to be a key player in averting the political assassination at the heart of your story. But if she's just a sideline character who never does much to affect the actual plot, then her role in the story is not only misleading readers, it's also derailing the plot's focus. Is this a political thriller or a romance? Readers won't know because neither do you. Unnecessary scenes fragment the story. The best stories are cohesive wholes. All their parts hang together in a way that makes perfect sense. When a story contains unnecessary scenes, those scenes are going to stick out from the rest of the story like pulled threads in a tapestry. It ruins the overall effect and may destroy whatever cohesion is maintained by the parts that actually are necessary. Okay, sure. Got it. Unnecessary scenes, bad. But how can you definitively identify and eliminate these little stinkers? The first step is to go through your manuscript scene by scene and deliberately analyze each of them. You have to do this consciously. It's not enough just to put this information in the back of your head and wait until a problematic scene jumps out at you. You must look at each scene in turn and double check its necessity to the story. First step is to mentally delete the scene. Take a look at each scene and visualize your manuscript without it. If you deleted this entire scene, what would happen to the rest of the story? Would the plot progression still make sense? Would the character's development be cohesive? Would the character's relationship still evolve naturally? If the answer to all three of these questions is yes, then stop visualizing the deletion and actually do it. If there's only one or two important elements in a scene, then consider how you might sew these elements into more intrinsic scenes so you can go ahead and delete this one. The second step is to sweep for darlings. Very often, unnecessary scenes wangle their way into our stories just because there's something about them that we adore. In short, they're darlings. Look through your story, scene by scene, and evaluate how much you love each one. The more you love it, the more you should scrutinize it to make sure your own emotions aren't getting in the way of your logical evaluation. Ask yourself these same questions as in the previous step. If the story can survive without any particular darling, get ruthless with yourself and chop it. The third step is to check the scene structure. The single best way to identify an unnecessary scene is to pay attention to your scene structure. When a story is working properly, with no extraneous parts, every single scene will build into the next scene. Remember, scenes are broken into two parts: action, which is called scene, and reaction, which is called sequel. Each one of these is in turn made up of three more parts. The scene is made up of goal, conflict, and disaster. The sequel is made up of reaction, dilemma, and decision. Whenever a scene is missing one of these parts, you know something is amiss. For the complete primer on scene structure, check out my book, Structuring Your Novel. So take a look at your novel. Look past the surface and dig down to the nitty-gritty of the scene level. Whenever you find a loose end, follow it to its source and ruthlessly cut it out. Do this consistently, and you will create a solid novel with no unnecessary scenes. Readers won't be able to look away. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.